The dust had not yet settled on the road behind her when Dorothy Barrett set her single worn leather bag down at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, and looked out at a horizon that held no promises. She had walked the last 4 miles into town after the stagecoach driver, a heavy-set man with a red face and no patience, had informed her that her fare only carried her as far as the crossroads. She had not argued. She had learned, over the course of the past year, that arguing with men who held the reins rarely ended in her favor. So she had climbed down from that rattling coach with her bag in hand, her chin lifted just enough to keep her dignity intact, and she had walked. Caldwell was a cattle town, the kind that smelled of livestock and leather and whiskey even at 8 in the morning. It sat on the Kansas and Indian Territory border like a gatekeeper for the Kishom Trail, and it had the rough, unfinished quality of a place that had not yet decided whether it intended to become civilized or simply stay wild. Buildings of raw timber lined the main street, a few with painted signs that were already fading in the relentless prairie wind. A hotel, a general store, a saloon that appeared to be open regardless of the hour, a land office with a queue of dusty men waiting outside. Dorothy stood at the edge of that main street and took it all in. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned at her nape, and eyes the color of river water when the sun hits it just right, a sort of amber green that shifted depending on her mood. She was not a small woman, not fragile, not the kind that made men rush to her side simply because she looked as though she might collapse. She was strong-shouldered and steady, the result of a childhood spent helping her father on a homestead outside of Abilene. But right now, standing at the edge of this unfamiliar town with everything she owned condensed into one leather bag, she felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding themselves together for so long that the effort has become its own kind of weight. Her father, Thomas Barrett, had died in February, a fever that swept through the county with no concern for who deserved to be taken and who did not. She had nursed him for 3 weeks, and then she had buried him in the hard winter ground, and then she had discovered that the homestead carried a lien she had not known about, placed there during a desperate winter 2 years prior when the crops had failed, and her father had borrowed from a man named Gerald Holt, who ran a lending operation out of Wichita with all the warmth and mercy of a January blizzard. Holt had arrived in March, just as the ground was beginning to thaw, with papers in hand and 2 hired men at his back. Dorothy had read the documents carefully, had consulted with the county clerk, had written 2 letters to lawyers in Abilene, and had received back only the confirmation of what she already feared. The debt was legitimate. The homestead was gone. She had spent the spring and early summer working as a seamstress in Abilene, living in a narrow room above the dry goods store, saving every penny she could. But Abilene was a place full of ghosts for her now, every corner holding the memory of something she had lost, and when she heard from a woman at the church that a dressmaker in Caldwell was looking for help, she had taken the last of her savings, bought a stagecoach ticket, and made her way south. The dressmaker's name was Mrs. Helen Greer, and her shop was situated between the hardware store and the land office. Dorothy had the address written on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket, and she consulted it now, shifting her bag from her right hand to her left and rolling her shoulder against the ache that had settled there. The bag was, in point of fact, quite heavy. It held everything she owned, which was not nothing, even if it was not much. 2 dresses, her good wool skirt, 3 changes of underclothes, her father's Bible, the small tin box that held his photograph, and the few letters her mother had written before she passed when Dorothy was 11, her sewing kit which was extensive and professional, her bank book showing a balance that could generously be described as modest, and a clay pot containing a cutting of the rose bush her father had planted the year her mother died. That rose cutting was the reason the bag was so heavy. The clay pot sat at the bottom, wrapped in one of her dresses for protection, and it added a weight that was entirely impractical and entirely worth it. She had just lifted the bag again and taken 2 steps toward the main street when she heard a voice. "That bag looks heavy." She turned. The man who had spoken was standing beside a dun-colored horse at the hitching post nearest the entrance to town. He was tall, broad through the shoulders but lean everywhere else, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that comes from years lived mostly outdoors. He wore a battered brown hat, work-worn trousers, boots that had seen considerable use, and a plain shirt the color of oatmeal. He had a bedroll lashed behind his saddle and a rifle in its scabbard, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, which she appreciated, and not the particular calculating assessment that some men in cattle towns directed at women traveling alone, which she appreciated even more. He looked, if anything, genuinely and simply concerned, as though he had noticed a problem and was considering whether he could be useful about it. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark eyes under the brim of that hat, and a jaw that carried 2 or 3 days of dark stubble. There was nothing especially remarkable about his face, except that it was entirely honest. You could see in it exactly what he was thinking, which was rare enough in any person that it counted as remarkable after all. "It is," Dorothy said, because it was the truth. "Where are you headed?" he asked, not in the way that meant he intended to follow her there, but in the way of a man who was already calculating distances and willing to do the math. "Mrs. Greer's dress shop," she said. "I'm told it's on this main street, but I'm not entirely certain where." "3 buildings down on the left," he said. "Past the hardware store. I can carry that for you if you'd like." Dorothy looked at him for a moment. She had developed, over the course of the past difficult year, a reasonably accurate sense for people, and what she read in this man was straightforward. He was offering to carry her bag because it was heavy and she was clearly tired, and that was the beginning and end of his motive. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He crossed to her in a few easy strides and took the bag from her hand. His expression shifted briefly when he felt the weight of it, a flicker of surprise that he was decent enough to suppress quickly. "What have you got in here?" he asked, falling into step beside her as she started down the street. "Everything I own," she said simply. He absorbed that without flinching. "There's a clay pot in here," he said. "A rose cutting," she said. "My father planted the original bush." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he understood, without needing it explained, why a clay pot full of soil would be worth carrying. "Perry Talbot," he said, shifting the bag to his left hand and extending his right. "Dorothy Barrett," she said, and shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, and his grip was firm without being performative. She liked that too. They walked the 3 buildings in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and Dorothy took in the street around her. A woman sweeping the steps of the hotel, 2 men in conversation outside the land office, a boy leading a mule, a dog sleeping in a patch of morning sun. The cattle smells and the leather smells, and underneath it all the clean scent of the prairie wind coming down from the north. "Have you been to Caldwell before?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm from Abilene. I worked as a seamstress there after my father passed. I've come to work for Mrs. Greer." "She's a good woman," Perry said, and the tone of it was matter-of-fact, the tone of a man who has no reason to say it other than that it's true. "You know her?" "My sister is one of her customers. I come through Caldwell a few times a year driving cattle up the trail. Just finished a run, heading back to Texas day after tomorrow." They had reached the dress shop. A neat hand-painted sign above the door read HGRER, Dressmaker and Alterations. The window displayed a length of blue calico and a finished dress on a wooden form. Perry set her bag down on the step, and Dorothy turned to thank him, and found him already looking at her with that same open, honest expression that had struck her at the edge of town. "I hope Caldwell is good to you, Miss Barrett," he said, and he meant it. You could hear it in the way he said it, not as pleasantry but as genuine wish. "Thank you, Mr. Talbot," she said, "for the bag and for the company." He touched the brim of his hat, walked back toward his horse, and Dorothy stood on the step of the dress shop and watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, before she picked up her bag and knocked on the door. Mrs. Helen Greer was a compact, energetic woman of about 50, with silver-streaked hair and the quick, precise movements of a person who has spent decades working with needle and thread. She greeted Dorothy with a firm handshake and an immediate tour of the shop, talking the whole time in a pleasant, rapid way that covered the terms of employment, the nature of the clientele, the layout of the workroom, and the location of the best light for detailed work, all within the span of about 10 minutes. The pay was fair. The room offered above the shop was small but clean, with a window that faced west and caught the afternoon light beautifully, and Mrs. Greer's manner was warm without being intrusive. Dorothy felt, for the first time since February, something close to relief. She spent that first afternoon unpacking her bag, arranging her small room, and placing the clay pot with the rose cutting on the windowsill where the light would be good. The cutting was still alive, barely, a few leaves still showing green among the brown. She watered it carefully from the pitcher on the washstand and told it quietly that it was going to be fine. Whether she was speaking to the rose or to herself was not entirely clear. She began work the following morning and discovered quickly that she was well suited to it. Her sewing was excellent, the result of years of self-taught practice and the natural steadiness of her hands, and she had a good eye for color and proportion that Mrs. Greer noticed and remarked upon within the first hour. "You have a talent," Mrs. Greer said, examining the hem Dorothy had just finished on a wool skirt. "More than you were letting on in your letter." "I didn't want to seem boastful," Dorothy said. "In this business it's called advertising," Mrs. Greer told her and smiled. Caldwell proved to be a town that worked hard and moved fast. The cattle trade brought a constant stream of people through, drovers and buyers and land speculators and settlers heading further west, and along with them came the particular energy of a place that was always in transit. Dorothy liked it. It was easier, she found, to be in a place that was still becoming itself, rather than a place where everything had already been decided. She settled into a rhythm. Early mornings in the workroom, afternoons serving customers with Mrs. Greer, evenings spent in her room sewing by lamplight or reading or tending to the rose cutting, which was, to her quiet delight, beginning to show signs of genuine recovery. A new bud was forming along one of the lower stems by the end of her first week. She had not thought much about Perry Talbot, or rather, she had thought about him in the way you think about a kind word received unexpectedly, returning to it occasionally with a small warmth, but not with any expectation attached to it. He had said he was leaving in 2 days. He was a cattle drover heading back to Texas. She was a seamstress who had just arrived in Caldwell. It was a pleasant, brief encounter, the kind that the West produced regularly, 2 people crossing paths and exchanging a moment of genuine human decency before the trail carried them in different directions. She had been in Caldwell for 10 days when she came down to the shop one morning to find him standing at the counter. He had his hat in his hand and he was talking to Mrs. Greer, and when the door at the top of the stairs opened and Dorothy appeared, he turned, and the honest face did that thing again where it showed exactly what was happening inside it, which was a flicker of something that looked very much like gladness. "Miss Barrett," he said. "Mr. Talbot," she said, and came down the stairs with considerably more composure than she felt. "I thought you were heading back to Texas." "Delayed," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her wonder just briefly whether the delay had been entirely involuntary. "One of the other drovers took ill. We're waiting on him to recover enough to travel." "I'm sorry to hear it," she said. "That your colleague is unwell, I mean." "He'll be fine," Perry said. "He's tough as old boot leather, as he himself has told me approximately 12 times. He looked briefly at Mrs. Greer, then back at Dorothy. "I came to see about having a shirt mended. The collar's coming away." Mrs. Greer, who was a woman of considerable perception and excellent manners, said that Dorothy would be happy to assist, and excused herself to the back workroom with a briskness that suggested she was giving them space on purpose and had no intention of admitting it. Dorothy examined the collar of the shirt Perry was carrying, which was indeed coming unstitched along one side, and quoted him a price and a timeline, and they discussed it in the professional way of seamstress and customer, and then they stood there for a moment with the transaction complete and neither of them in any hurry to end it. "How are you finding Caldwell?" he asked. "Well," she said, "Mrs. Greer is exactly as you described her. The town is busy, which I like. My room has good western light." She paused. "The rose cutting is producing a new bud." Something genuinely pleased crossed his face. "Good," he said with a warmth that was all out of proportion to the subject and entirely appropriate for it. "How long has your colleague been ill?" she asked. 4 days. Doc says another week, maybe less." "So you have a week in Caldwell with no particular occupation?" "Except getting shirts mended," he said. "Do you have many shirts that need mending?" "Potentially," he said, and there was a careful humor in it that she found she liked very much. She laughed, which surprised her a little, because she had not laughed with ease since before her father died. "Well, we are at your service," she said. He came back for the mended shirt 2 days later, and they talked for half an hour, leaning against the counter while Mrs. Greer worked in the back with pointed studiousness. They talked about Abilene and about Texas, about the cattle trade and its particular hardships, about what Caldwell was like during the high season of the drives when the population doubled with drovers, and the saloons ran until dawn. Perry told her about the ranch he worked for, a spread called the Double Cross, owned by a man named Ed Calloway out of Laredo, and about the trail north, the Red River crossing that was always treacherous, the way the Cimarron could surprise you even when you thought you knew it. Dorothy told him about her father's homestead, about learning to sew because they couldn't afford a seamstress, and she was the one with the steady hands, about her mother's rose bush that had survived the hard winter of 1874 by some combination of stubbornness and miracle, about discovering that she genuinely loved the work of cloth and needle, the way a thing could be made from nothing or repaired from ruin by careful attention. He listened to all of it with the focused quality of a person who is not thinking about what they'll say next, but is actually listening, which was, she had decided, the rarest and most valuable social skill a person could possess. He asked if she would walk with him on Sunday when the shop was closed. She said yes. They walked south along the edge of town, past the cattle pens, which were largely empty in this shoulder season between drives, and out onto the flat prairie where the grass was going gold with the autumn and the sky was enormous and blue. They walked for 2 hours, and the conversation was as easy as if they had known each other a very long time, and when they turned back toward town, the sun was angled low and golden, and it lit the side of Perry's face, and Dorothy looked at him and thought, with a clarity that startled her, that this was a man she could love. She did not say it. She was a practical woman, and she had known him for less than 2 weeks, and she had enough difficulty to manage without adding the complication of a feeling she wasn't sure would be returned. But she held it quietly, the way she had held the hope for the rose cutting. Perry's colleague, whose name was Bud Haney, was a leathery man of about 50 who recovered from his fever faster than the doctor had predicted, and on the Thursday of that second week, Perry came to the shop to tell Dorothy that they would be leaving on Saturday. He stood across the counter from her and delivered this information without quite meeting her eyes, and she watched him struggle with something and emerge from the struggle with his jaw set. "I'd like to write to you," he said, "if that's agreeable." She felt the warmth that had been growing quietly inside her for these 2 weeks flare up like a lamp turned higher. "It's agreeable," she said. "I'll be back through Caldwell in the spring," he said. "The trail north starts in April most years. I'll come through here. The rose will likely be blooming by then," she said. He looked at her, and the honest face was very honest just then, and she understood that he was feeling the same thing she was feeling, which was the difficulty of leaving something you have only just begun to find. "Take care of yourself, Miss Barrett," he said. "Dorothy," she said. He smiled, slow and genuine. "Dorothy," he said. "Take care of yourself, Perry," she said. He put his hat on, touched the brim, and walked out into the Caldwell street, and this time Dorothy did not watch him go from the step. She went to the workroom and sat down at her sewing table and put her hands flat on the cloth in front of her and breathed slowly until the tightness in her chest eased into something she could manage. Mrs. Greer appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the diplomatic blindness of a woman who has seen this particular scene before. "It's good coffee this morning," she said, setting a cup by Dorothy's hand. "Thank you, Helen," Dorothy said. Mrs. Greer sat down across from her, and they drank their coffee in a comfortable silence. And outside the window the prairie wind moved through Caldwell, and the sign above the hardware store creaked on its hook. The winter came in earnest by November, the kind of Kansas winter that arrives without ceremony and intends to stay. Dorothy was grateful for the work, which was steady and absorbing, and for Mrs. Greer's company, which was consistently good. The older woman had been widowed 8 years prior and had built her business and her life in Caldwell with a self-possession that Dorothy found deeply admirable, and they developed, over those winter months, a friendship that went well beyond employer and employee. Perry's first letter arrived in late October. It had been written in Wichita, before he cleared the Kansas border heading south, and it was 3 pages in a clear, slightly slanted hand on plain paper. He described the trail south, a sudden squall near the Cimarron that had scattered the remuda and cost them 3 hours, the way the light changed as they moved deeper into Indian territory, a conversation he'd had with Bud Haney about the nature of contentment that had apparently given them both something to think about for the better part of a day's riding. He did not write anything sentimental. He did not have to. The letters were the correspondence of someone who wanted another person to know exactly where they were and what they were seeing, and what that communicated, without needing to be stated, was that he was thinking of her. She wrote back immediately, 3 pages of her own about Caldwell in autumn, about a difficult alteration job that had challenged and then satisfied her, about the rose cutting which now had 2 confirmed buds and 3 new leaves, about a conversation she had with a woman who had come in for a dress fitting and told Dorothy about the settlement she and her husband were establishing 20 miles west, about what the Kansas prairie looked like when the first frost came and the grass turned silver. They wrote through the winter. The letters came roughly once a month, given the distances and the unreliability of the post, and Dorothy read each one several times before putting it in the tin box that had held her father's photograph, and now held both. She put her father's photograph on the windowsill beside the rose, which had grown through the winter with a quiet determination that she found moving. There were things in the letters, lines and observations, that she returned to in the evenings when the shop was closed, and the street was quiet, and Caldwell held that particular hush of a winter night on the prairie. Perry wrote about the Double Cross Ranch and the work of it, repairing fences in the cold months, managing the livestock, the rhythm of ranch life that was different from the drive but had its own demands. He wrote about Ed Calloway, who was a fair employer and a hard-headed businessman. He wrote about Bud Haney teaching him a card game he'd learned from a riverboat gambler in his youth, which Bud claimed to have invented himself, and which Perry was reasonably certain was an outright lie. He wrote once, in a January letter, about what he wanted from his life. He did it carefully, not as confession but as observation, the way a man who is not practiced at speaking his interior life finds a sideways route to the territory. He said that he had spent most of his adult years in transit, always moving with the trail, and that he had begun to think about whether transit was a means to something or a destination in itself. He said he thought a man ought to have a piece of ground to call his own, and something worth coming home to. Dorothy read that letter by lamplight with the rose casting a small shadow on the wall behind it, and she thought about her father's homestead and the way she had felt the morning she left it for the last time, looking back from the road at the house and the garden and the rose bush. And she thought about the rose cutting on her windowsill and what it meant that she had carried it all this way. And she wrote back to him that she agreed entirely, that transit was exhausting in itself, and that the most sustaining thing she owned was not the clothes or the sewing kit or even the money she was slowly accumulating, but the rose cutting, because it reminded her that some things survive the uprooting and put down roots again and grow. He did not respond directly to that passage, but his next letter in February was 4 pages instead of 3, and warmer in its register than any previous one, and in the final paragraph he wrote, "I have been thinking about Caldwell in the spring. I believe I am looking forward to it more than any season I can remember." She pressed that letter flat against her chest when she finished reading it and sat for a moment in her small, warm room above the dress shop. And the rose cast its little shadow on the wall, and the Kansas winter pressed against the window, and she was aware of a happiness that was growing in her the way the rose was growing, steadily and against the odds, because the conditions were right. The spring came slowly to southern Kansas, as it tends to do, teasing at warmth and then retreating. But by late March the days were lengthening and the prairie was showing green beneath the gold. And the rose on Dorothy's windowsill had put out 3 full buds that were very nearly ready to open. The cattle drives from Texas started moving north in April. Dorothy did not know exactly when to expect Perry, only that it would be April or May, depending on the weather and the condition of the river crossings. She found herself, during those weeks, listening for horses on the main street in a way she hadn't let herself admit until she caught herself doing it for the 3rd time in an afternoon. He arrived on the 14th of April, 1879. She was in the front of the shop, fitting a dress on Mrs. Clara Whitmore, who was the wife of one of the town's wealthier merchants and had opinions about everything including the precise angle at which a collar should sit, when the door opened and the small bell above it chimed and she looked up and it was Perry. He looked different than she remembered, and exactly the same. He had gotten a haircut recently and shaved that morning, and he was wearing his second-best shirt, which she recognized from a description in one of his letters. He had his hat in his hand and he stood in the doorway with the April sunlight behind him, and he looked at her with the honest face turned fully honest, no restraint in it at all. "Mr. Talbot," she said with great steadiness. "Miss Barrett," he said, with roughly the same amount of steadiness, which was to say, barely any. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, who was no fool, looked between them with the pleased and knowing expression of a woman who has correctly identified a situation. "I believe the collar is fine where it is," she said to Dorothy, generously releasing them both. Dorothy finished the fitting in approximately half the time she would normally have taken, which Mrs. Whitmore bore with gracious patience. And then the door closed behind her customer, and Dorothy and Perry were alone in the shop, and the bell above the door was still faintly resonating. "The rose is blooming," she said. "I hoped it would be," he said. They stood 6 feet apart in the dress shop and looked at each other, and then Dorothy said, "Are you in Caldwell long?" "We're resting the herd south of town for 3 days," he said. "I have 3 days." "Then we had better use them," she said. They did. They walked in the evenings after the shop closed, out onto the prairie where the spring grass was coming in bright, and the meadowlarks were announcing themselves from every fence post, and they sat on the bank of a shallow creek south of town and watched the water move, and they rode out one afternoon on horses Perry borrowed from the livery, far enough out on the plains that the town disappeared behind them, and there was nothing in any direction but grass and sky. On the second evening, sitting by the creek with the sun going down behind the low hills to the west, Perry said, "I've been thinking about what you wrote in that letter, about the rose cutting and putting down roots." "I remember writing it," she said. "I've been thinking about staying in Kansas," he said. "Ed Calloway has a foreman position open at a small ranch he bought near Caldwell last year. He offered it to me in the winter. I've been considering it." Dorothy kept her eyes on the creek. "What have you decided?" "Nothing yet," he said. "I wanted to ask you something first." She looked at him then, and the honest face was as honest as she had ever seen it, which meant it was very honest indeed. "I want to know if I am right in thinking," he said, carefully and seriously, "that what is between us is worth building on." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The creek moved over its stones, and the meadowlark sang from the far bank, and the last of the daylight was warm and low and golden. "You are right," she said. He let out a breath that he had evidently been holding for some time. "Good," he said, and it came out with such relief and warmth that she laughed, and he laughed with her, and something that had been held carefully in reserve between them was suddenly simply open. He took her hand, there by the creek in the April evening. It was a deliberate, gentle thing, his hand around hers, and they sat like that as the light faded, talking and not talking with equal comfort. And Dorothy thought about the bag she had carried into this town 6 months ago with everything she owned in it, and how it had been heavy with the weight of all she had lost, and how something new had started, unexpectedly and simply, when a man at a hitching post had looked at her and said, "That bag looks heavy." On the third morning before the drive moved on, Perry came to the shop early and stood at the counter informally, with a seriousness that she found both touching and slightly comical given what they had already said to each other by the creek, asked if he might court her properly. "Yes," she said, "you may court me properly. I'll take the foreman position," he said. "I'll write to Calloway this week." "Do you want it?" she asked. "The position, not just the proximity to Caldwell?" "Both," he said. "In equal measure and without apology," she smiled. "Then write to him," she said. He left with the drive that morning, heading north to Wichita, and Dorothy stood in the doorway of the dress shop, and this time she did watch him go, all the way down the main street and around the curve in the road and out of sight, and she did not feel the tightness she had felt in October because this time she knew he was coming back. Perry returned to Caldwell in June, having completed the drive and settled his affairs with Ed Calloway, who had granted him the foreman position on the Caldwell area ranch, a 2,000-acre spread called the Hennessy Place that Calloway had purchased from a family heading to Oregon. Perry arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday with his horse and his bedroll and his modest belongings, and he spent the first week getting the Hennessy ranch in order, assessing what needed doing, hiring 2 men to help with the cattle that were already on the property. He came to the shop every day that week, sometimes for no longer than 20 minutes, buying coffee from the hotel next door and bringing Dorothy a cup, and they talked over the counter or in the workroom in the way of 2 people who are building something and checking on its progress daily with pleasure and care. Mrs. Greer watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen it coming since October and had simply been patient enough to let it arrive at its own pace. "He's a good man," she told Dorothy one morning after Perry had stopped in and left. "I can see it without any particular effort." "I think so too," Dorothy said. "Don't let it take too long," Mrs. Greer said, with the directness of a woman who has learned the value of time. "Things worth having shouldn't be made to wait indefinitely." Dorothy thought about that. She had been cautious because caution had served her during a difficult year, but she understood the distinction between caution and delay for its own sake. On a warm Saturday in July, Perry Talbot rode into town on his dun horse, and he had cleaned up considerably, his good shirt, his hat brushed, and he had brought a handful of prairie wildflowers that he had cut from the land around the Hennessy Ranch, purple coneflowers and yellow-headed prairie sunflowers, and he came into the shop and presented them to Dorothy with a straightforwardness that bypassed ceremony entirely. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since October, or possibly since the first morning, when you told me the heavy thing in your bag was a rose cutting for your father. I want to marry you, Dorothy. I want to build something here with you. I have the ranch and the position, and I have more than I've ever had materially, and none of it means much compared to you. Will you marry me?" Dorothy stood in her dress shop with a handful of prairie wildflowers and a man looking at her with that wide-open, honest face, and she thought of every road she had walked, every difficulty she had come through, every morning she had tended to the rose cutting and told it quietly that it was going to be fine. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He kissed her then, there in the dress shop, and it was not tentative or uncertain. It was the kiss of 2 people who have been moving toward each other for the better part of a year and have finally, decisively, arrived. Mrs. Greer, who had been in the workroom, emerged with the particular timing of a person who had been listening for the specific pause in conversation that indicated the proposal had been made, and found them standing together with the wildflowers and matching expressions of happiness, and she clasped her hands together and said, "Excellent," with the tone of someone who has accomplished something, which in a way she had. Since it was she who had hired Dorothy, and she who had given Perry the character reference that had cemented his decision to take the Caldwell position. They were married in September of 1879 in the small Methodist church on the eastern side of Caldwell, in a ceremony attended by Mrs. Greer Bud Haney, who had made the ride up from Texas specifically for the occasion. Two of the ranch hands Perry had hired, Clara Whitmore, who had developed a fond interest in Dorothy's romantic situation since the afternoon she had witnessed its beginning, and a handful of other Caldwell residents who had come to know Dorothy over the course of her year in town. Dorothy wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with a modest lace collar, and she carried a single bloom cut from the rose bush on her windowsill, which had flourished through the summer into a proper plant with 7 open flowers. The bloom was pale pink, almost white, with a honey scent that caught in the warm September air when she walked down the short aisle toward Perry, who stood at the front with his good hat in his hands, and his face doing the thing it always did, showing exactly what was inside, which was a love so uncomplicated and thorough that it had nowhere to hide and no reason to. Bud Haney cried, which he denied vigorously afterward and continued to deny for the remainder of his life. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the hotel's dining room, with the best meal Caldwell's kitchen could produce, which was quite good, and dancing afterward in the cleared space of the saloon, which was the only room large enough, and Dorothy danced with Perry until her feet ached and she did not care at all. They moved to the Hennessy Ranch that evening. Perry had spent the previous 2 months making the house habitable, repairing the roof, whitewashing the interior walls, building a proper shelf for the kitchen, putting glass in the 2 windows that had been covered with oilcloth. It was a modest house, 4 rooms, but it was solid and it had good bones, and it sat on a slight rise that gave it a view of the prairie in all directions. And when Dorothy came through the door for the first time as its mistress, she saw that Perry had placed the rose, pot and all, on the sill of the south-facing window. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. "I brought it over yesterday," he said. "I hoped you wouldn't mind." She turned to him and kissed him in answer, and he put his arms around her in the warm lamplight of their house on the Kansas prairie, and outside the wind moved through the autumn grass, and the rose cast its shadow on the whitewashed wall. The first full year on the ranch was demanding and full. Perry worked long hours managing the Hennessy cattle and the property, working with Ed Calloway's occasional direction from Laredo, but largely with the considerable independence that came from being a foreman trusted by an employer who was not physically present most of the time. He hired a 3rd ranch hand, a young man named Will Foster who was 17 and had come up from Oklahoma Territory looking for work, and he proved himself capable and willing enough that Perry kept him on permanently. Dorothy continued her work with Mrs. Greer during the week, riding into Caldwell each morning on the gentle mare Perry had bought for her from the livery, a gray horse she named Nell. She had negotiated, with Mrs. Greer's enthusiastic agreement, a partnership arrangement rather than employment, contributing to the shop's work and reputation and sharing in its income, which suited them both well and reflected the genuine partnership their working relationship had become. She planted the rose in the ground that first spring, choosing a sheltered spot against the south wall of the house where it would have sun and some protection from the Kansas winds. She transplanted it carefully on a mild day in April, and it sulked briefly as rose cuttings always do when moved, and then it caught and sent up new growth, and by May it was blooming with a vigor that suggested it had been waiting for ground to put its roots in properly. There was an incident that autumn, a dispute with a neighboring property owner named James Corbin over the line of a fence, and the water rights to a creek that ran along the property boundary. Corbin was a large, ill-tempered man who had been trying to expand his holdings in the area for 3 years, and had a habit of interpreting property lines in whatever direction benefited him. The dispute was heated, and at one point, Corbin rode onto the Hennessy land with 2 men and physically tore down 50 yards of fence before Perry arrived, and, with a calm that Dorothy had come to recognize as more formidable than anger, told Corbin that the county surveyor's records were clear, and that the next fence that came down would be followed immediately by the county sheriff. Corbin went away furious, and Perry spent a week documenting everything with the county clerk, and Corbin ultimately backed down, which Perry had predicted he would because men of that type, he explained to Dorothy that evening, are essentially large bluffs and do not actually hold when they meet calm clarity. Dorothy had watched the whole business and filed it away in her growing understanding of her husband, which was that he was a man who did not perform strength but actually possessed it, and that this was a distinction that mattered more than she had fully understood before she knew him. They had other difficulties, as any young couple building a life in the 1879 Kansas territory necessarily would. A harsh winter in their second year that killed 6 cattle and required them to buy feed at prices that strained their savings. A summer drought the following year that worried everyone and ultimately broke in August with 3 days of the most grateful rain Dorothy had ever seen fall. The ongoing uncertainty of the cattle market, which Perry navigated with the practical intelligence of a man who had spent 15 years understanding it from the ground up. There were also the quieter injustices of the time and place, things Dorothy saw and could not always do much about but felt keenly. She saw the way the Osage and Kaw people who sometimes came through the area were treated in Caldwell's businesses, the casual discourtesy that some of the shopkeepers thought nothing of, the way the land arrangements that had brought so many settlers to Kansas had come at a profound cost that most of those settlers did not discuss. She was not in a position to change large things, but she made a habit of basic human decency in every interaction, and she was known in Caldwell for it, and it mattered at least in the small radius that she occupied. Perry shared her views, which she had already suspected from things he had said in their letters but confirmed in their daily life together. He treated every person who came to work on the ranch or do business with him with an equitable straightforwardness that won him a reputation in the area for fairness, and Dorothy loved him for it with a specificity that went beyond general admiration. In the spring of 1881, Dorothy became pregnant with their first child. She told Perry on a Sunday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, and he went very still for a moment in the way he sometimes did when something struck him with great force, and then his face did that thing, the full open honesty of it, and what was there was a joy so complete that it momentarily took his words away. "Well," he said after a moment. "Well, well," she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the morning kitchen light holding hands like the day by the creek in the first April, and the rose was blooming against the south wall of the house, and the prairie stretched in every direction, and the life they were building was real and warm and theirs. The pregnancy went well, and Dorothy continued her work at the shop through the summer, scaling back in the last months as her energy required it. Perry was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact right calibration, building the cradle himself from good pine in the evenings, reading to her from the almanac and the newspaper, and occasionally from a novel she had procured from the general store, which he did with an earnestness that made her love him past the capacity to articulate it. Their son was born in December of 1881, delivered by the doctor who came out from Caldwell on a bitter cold day, attended also by Mrs. Greer, who had appointed herself to this position, and whose competence in a crisis Dorothy had good reason to be grateful for. The birth was hard and long, and Perry sat outside the bedroom door for 7 hours without eating or sleeping, and Dorothy could hear him occasionally speaking quietly, whether to God or to himself or to the walls. She was not sure. The child arrived healthy and loud, 7 pounds of red-faced determination, and when Perry was finally permitted into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and held his son for the first time, Dorothy watched his face and thought she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. "What do we name him?" Perry said. "Thomas," Dorothy said. "For my father." Perry looked at her and his eyes were bright. "Thomas Talbot," he said. "Thomas Barrett Talbot," she said. "Yes," he said, with great solemnity. And then the baby made a sound, and Perry looked down at him with an expression of absolute undone love. And Dorothy put her head back on the pillow and closed her eyes and felt the deep, full completeness of it. Thomas Barrett Talbot was a vigorous and opinionated child from his earliest days, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's chestnut hair. And he showed, almost from birth, a particular interest in everything that moved, which on a working cattle ranch meant he was interested in nearly everything. By the time he was walking, he was following Perry around the yard with a concentration that the ranch hands found extremely entertaining, and by 3 years old, he was climbing fences with an agility that gave Dorothy consistent heart failure. Mrs. Greer was his unofficial grandmother, appearing at the ranch at least once a week, with something she had baked and opinions about child-rearing that were offered with enough humor to be received rather than resisted. Bud Haney came north once a year and was consistently won over by Thomas within the first hour of each visit, maintaining throughout his life the fiction that he was not susceptible to children, while being obviously completely susceptible to this one in particular. In 1883, when Thomas was a year and a half old, Dorothy became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy had a different texture, a weariness in the early months that was more pronounced, and the doctor in Caldwell, who had grown more attentive to the Talbot family over the years, monitored it with care. Dorothy carried the child to term and delivered her in October, a girl, smaller than Thomas had been but healthy, with Perry's calm dark eyes and a disposition that was, from the start, quieter and more observant than her brother's explosive engagement with the world. "Eleanor," Dorothy said when Perry asked, "after no one in particular, just because it suits her." Perry looked at the baby, who was looking back at him with those dark eyes as if she was already forming assessments. "Eleanor Talbot," he said, "it does suit her." Eleanor proved this assessment correct as she grew. She was thoughtful and precise and had her mother's steady hands, and she was quietly fearless in a way that was somehow more impressive than Thomas's loud fearlessness, because hers was considered. By the time she was 2, she could spend an hour examining a single flower with a concentration that Dorothy found both remarkable and familiar. Life on the ranch found its rhythm through these years: 1882, 1883, 1884. A rhythm that had its difficulties and its beauties and its full range of ordinary human texture. Perry managed the Hennessy property with increasing skill and was considered one of the better ranch foremen in the Caldwell area, and his relationship with Ed Calloway had evolved from employee and employer to something closer to genuine mutual regard. Calloway came north once in the summer of 1883 and spent 3 days at the ranch, and Dorothy fed him well, and he was a gruff, decent man who clearly thought Perry had done something exceptionally right, and was willing to express this in the Kansas indirect way of saying very little but meaning a great deal. Dorothy's dress shop partnership with Mrs. Greer continued to flourish. Caldwell was changing in these years, the wildest days of the open cattle trade beginning to give way to a more settled town life as the settlement of Kansas proceeded, and the state worked to close its borders to the Texas cattle drives that were blamed for carrying the tick fever that devastated local cattle. It was a complicated and sometimes painful transition for a town whose economy had been built on the drives, and Dorothy watched it and made adjustments, diversifying the shop's work toward the more domestic and community-centered needs of a settling population. She wrote about all of this in letters to Perry's sister in Laredo, whom she had never met but with whom she had developed a warm correspondence, and to two women she had known in Abilene who had scattered themselves to other parts of the territory. She was a faithful correspondent, had been since her father had taught her that letters were how the scattered kept their connections intact. In the winter of 1884, when Thomas was 3 and Alina was a year old, Perry came home from Caldwell with an expression on his face that Dorothy had learned to read as the sign of news being processed before being delivered. She set down the mending she was doing and waited. "Ed Calloway wants to sell the Hennessy Ranch," he said. "He's consolidating, pulling his Kansas holdings and putting the money further west." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean for us?" "It means the ranch goes up for sale unless someone buys it first." He paused. "He's offered me first right of purchase. He'd carry part of the note given our history." She understood what he was not quite saying. "What does it cost?" He told her the number. It was large. It was not impossible. She did the arithmetic in her head, which took a few minutes and required her to recall what she knew of their savings and her income from the shop and the probable credit they could access from the bank in Caldwell. "We'd be tight for several years," she said. "Yes," he said, "and the cattle market is uncertain. If we had 2 or 3 bad years together, it could be very difficult." "But you want it," she said. He looked at her directly. "I want to own the ground we're standing on," he said. "I want Thomas and Alina to have something that belongs to them, something that can't be called in." She heard what was in that, the echo of her father's homestead and the lien she had not known about. She heard her own letter from 3 years ago, about the rows cutting and putting down roots, about surviving the uprooting and growing again. "Then let's buy it," she said. Perry crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her for a long moment. "It's a considerable risk," he said. "So was carrying a rose cutting 400 miles in a leather bag," she said. "And that turned out fine." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and they spent the rest of the evening at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, working through the numbers with the careful optimism of two people who understand risk and have chosen each other fully enough to take it together. The purchase was completed in the spring of 1885. They signed the papers in the bank in Caldwell with the banker, a careful man named Harrison Dowd, presiding, and Ed Calloway's agent witnessing. And when it was done, Dorothy and Perry walked out into the Caldwell street as the owners of the Hennessy Ranch, 2,000 acres of Kansas prairie. And Dorothy thought of the edge of this same street 6 years ago. A woman with one heavy bag and no plan beyond the address written on a folded paper in her coat pocket. She said this to Perry as they stood on the boardwalk in the March sunlight. "Do you remember the morning I arrived?" she said. "I remember everything about it," he said, without hesitation. "You had on a gray coat. You had walked 4 miles from the crossroads. You were not going to ask anyone for help. You offered before I had to," she said. "You looked like you could manage it on your own," he said. "But there was no reason you should have to." She took his arm and they walked back through Caldwell together toward where Nell and his horse were tied, and the spring wind came down from the north with the smell of new grass in it. And Thomas was at the ranch with Will Foster, who had stayed on and become as much a part of the ranch's life as the fences and the cattle, and Alina was at the shop with Mrs. Greer, who had taken to caring for her on these trips to town with the proprietorial affection of a grandmother, and no concern whatsoever for the technicality that she was not. The years that followed the purchase of the Hennessy Ranch, which they renamed the Barrett Talbot place, by the quiet and mutual unspoken agreement of simply starting to call it that, were years of accumulating goodness. Not without difficulty, because difficulty was not optional in this life or any other, but the difficulties were ones they moved through together, and the accumulated weight of moving through them together had made them, by the late 1880s, one of those couples who are so obviously right that other people feel the rightness of it from a distance. The ranch grew, slowly and carefully, as Perry expanded the herd with the methodical patience of a man who understood cattle and refused to extend himself past what the land could support. They hired a second full-time hand and built a bunkhouse properly in 1886. Dorothy's partnership with Mrs. Greer produced enough income through the dress shop that she was eventually able to hire a young woman, a recent arrival named Alice Pratt, who had come from Missouri with her family and had a quick aptitude for sewing, to take on some of the workload, which allowed Dorothy to be at the ranch more in the afternoons and to spend those hours doing the work she had come to love just as much as sewing, which was the work of her household and her garden and her children and her husband. The rose bush against the south wall of the house had by 1886 become a considerable and glorious thing, climbing the wall and reaching toward the roof line, producing blooms from May through September that scented the entire south side of the house on warm evenings. Dorothy pruned it every spring and talked to it the way she had always talked to it, quietly and with affectionate practicality, and Perry had at some point stopped finding this eccentric and started accepting it as simply the proper relationship between Dorothy and that particular plant. Thomas grew up with the ranch in his bones. He was a serious and competent boy who learned to ride early and well, and he had his father's gift for the quiet reading of an animal's temperament that was worth more in cattle work than almost any other skill. He was good in school when he attended the schoolhouse that had been established on the western side of Caldwell in 1885, but his real intelligence expressed itself in the practical and the physical, and Perry taught him everything he knew about the land and the livestock with a patience and specificity that Dorothy observed with love from across whatever room or yard she happened to be in. Eleanor was different, as children are. She took to her mother's sewing with an aptitude that pleased Dorothy beyond measure, sitting at the workroom table in town with a piece of scrap cloth and a needle and learning by close observation before she was 3 years old. But Eleanor was also a reader, a devourer of every book and newspaper and pamphlet that came within her reach, and Dorothy fed this appetite systematically and with conviction, believing in her daughter's intelligence with the fierce practicality of a woman who knew what an education, properly applied, could do for a person's life and options. In 1887, Mrs. Helen Greer fell ill with a chest sickness that kept her bedridden through the winter. Dorothy visited every other day through those months, bringing food and company and managing the shop with Alice, and it was during those visits that Mrs. Greer, who was not a woman given to false comfort or unnecessary talk, spoke with Dorothy about the shop and the future. "I am not going to die from this," Mrs. Greer said one February afternoon, with the directness that was her native mode. "But I am going to take longer to recover than I would like, and when I am recovered I do not think I am going to return to the shop at the pace I have maintained." "We can adjust," Dorothy said. "I know we can," Mrs. Greer said. "I want you to buy my share." Dorothy sat with this for a moment. "The shop, I want you to own it. We'll price it fairly. I'll take monthly payments over time if a lump sum isn't possible. You've run it as well as I ever did for the past 2 years and better than I did in the last 6 months before I took ill. It should be yours." Dorothy thought about the leather bag at the edge of town and the address on the folded paper and the woman who had knocked on this woman's door and been given something that turned out to be far more than a job. "Helen," she said. "I know," Mrs. Greer said with her efficient warmth, "but sentiment doesn't need a lot of time. Let's agree and I'll have Harrison Dowd draw up the papers." The shop became Dorothy's in the spring of 1887, and she named it Barrett and Greer, keeping Mrs. Greer's name because the woman had built it, and because Caldwell knew it by that name, and because Dorothy thought it mattered to honor where things came from. Mrs. Greer recovered fully enough that by summer she was in the shop 3 days a week, which was what she wanted and what she could manage, and she was there on those 3 days with the full force of her original personality, and the arrangement suited everyone perfectly. Caldwell continued to change through the late 1880s as Kansas closed its borders to the Texas cattle drives, the Kishom Trail effectively ending as a major commercial route by 1886 and 1887 as the quarantine laws took hold. The town that had been built on the cattle trade remade itself, imperfectly, and with the particular difficulty of any place that must find a new reason to exist, but it managed, because enough of its people had put down real roots and intended to stay and make something permanent. The Barrett Talbot Ranch managed the transition better than some, because Perry had always been more interested in quality than quantity, and had never built his operation on the assumption that the drive market would last forever. He shifted toward supplying local butchers and a growing network of settlements in the area, and while it was not the same income as the drive years, it was stable and consistent. Dorothy, walking home through Caldwell one evening in the autumn of 1888, passed the spot at the edge of the main street where she had stood 9 years ago with a heavy bag, and she stopped and looked at it for a moment. Just the dusty edge of the road and the hitching post that had been replaced twice since then, but stood in the same place, and the wide prairie sky above it turning colors she had never learned the names for. She thought about Thomas Barrett, her father, and the homestead, and the rose bush, and the long, difficult year after he died. She thought about the folded paper in her coat pocket, and the 4 miles she had walked from the crossroads, and the way her shoulder had ached from the bag. She thought about the moment she had heard a voice behind her, unhurried and genuine, saying those words. She was glad, with a completeness that went all the way through her, for every single thing that had led to that moment, even the losses, because without them she would not have been standing at the edge of this town with that bag, and Perry Talbot would have been at a hitching post, and she would not have been the person he noticed. She walked home in the blue autumn dusk, and Perry was on the porch with a leaner on his knee and Thomas sitting on the step beside him, and the lamplight was warm through the window, and the rose was long finished blooming for the season, but its canes were still green, and Perry looked up when he heard her coming, and his face did what it had always done, showed everything. "You're late," he said. "I stopped to think," she said, coming up the path. "About what?" She climbed the porch steps and kissed him, and then sat down beside him and took his free hand. "About how heavy the bag was," she said. He understood immediately, as he always understood the things she said that carried their full private history. He squeezed her hand, and Alina regarded this with the thoughtful, dark-eyed attention she brought to everything, and Thomas said from the step, "What bag?" "I'll tell you sometime," Dorothy said. "Tell me now," Thomas said. Dorothy looked at Perry. Perry looked at Dorothy. Something passed between them that was 10 years long and as light as a prairie wind. "Your mother came to Caldwell with everything she owned in one bag," Perry said to his son, "and the bag was heavy, and I offered to carry it." "And then what?" Thomas said. "And then I built my whole life," Dorothy said, simply and precisely. Thomas considered this with 9-year-old practicality. "That's a lot from one bag," he said. "It was a very good bag," Perry said, and Dorothy laughed and rested her head on his shoulder, and the Kansas night came down soft and full of stars. In the spring of 1889, Perry turned 39 and Dorothy turned 35, and they marked these birthdays in their usual understated way. Good dinners at home with the children, and on Perry's birthday, a remarkable dried apple cake that Dorothy made from a recipe Mrs. Greer had produced with ceremony from a box of accumulated receipts, and on Dorothy's birthday Perry presented her with a new sewing case, real leather with brass fittings, that he had ordered from a catalog in January and had been concealing in the bunkhouse for 2 months. She held it for a long time without speaking. "The other one is worn through," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been putting off replacing it." "I noticed," he said. She looked at him. "You notice everything." "Only about you," he said. She kissed him and put the old sewing case on the shelf above the fireplace, because some things you keep even when you have a better version, and that was where it stayed. That summer they made an improvement to the house that Dorothy had been thinking about for 2 years. A proper covered porch on the south side, close to the rows, where there could be chairs and an afternoon could be spent in the shade looking out over the land. Perry and Will Foster and Thomas, who was now 10 and entirely capable of being useful in such projects, built it over 2 weekends in June, and it was exactly what Dorothy had envisioned, wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table, with a good view of the garden she had established and the open pasture beyond. She spent many evenings on that porch through the summer and autumn of 1889, sometimes with Perry, sometimes alone when he was at the far end of the property, sometimes with a leaner who would bring a book and read while Dorothy sewed, and sometimes with Mrs. Greer on the days when the older woman came to the ranch for Sunday dinner, which had become a comfortable and regular habit. It was on that porch in the evening of a September day in 1889 that Dorothy sat with Perry after the children were in bed and told him that she was expecting again. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "A little tired, but that's early days." He reached across and took her hand. They sat for a while in the warm September dark, listening to the prairie insects and the distant sound of cattle and the quieter sounds of the house. "What do you want this time?" he said. "I want us all to be well," she said. "That's the only thing I ever really want." "You'll have it," he said, with a certainty that was not bravado but the deep-settled confidence of a man who intends to do everything in his power to ensure what he has promised. The child was born in April of 1890, a boy, easier than the first 2 births, and arrived with what the doctor described as considerable promptness, and what Dorothy described as most welcome efficiency. He was a round and placid baby, the most even-tempered of the 3, and he had Dorothy's amber-green eyes and Perry's dark hair, and he looked at the world from his earliest days with a mild curiosity that suggested he found it interesting but not overwhelming. They named him James Greer Talbot, after Mrs. Helen Greer, who was present at the birth, and who received this news with composure that lasted approximately 30 seconds before she had to sit down. "You cannot name the baby after me," she said, sitting very straight in the rocking chair Perry had moved into the bedroom for her. "We can and have," Dorothy said from the bed. "Mrs. Greer looked at the baby, who looked back at her with those calm amber-green eyes. "James Greer Talbot," she said softly, as if testing the weight of it. "It suits him," Perry said from the doorway. "It does," Mrs. Greer admitted, and there was nothing more to say. The 1890s brought changes to the Kansas prairie at a pace that was sometimes dizzying and sometimes simply felt like the natural unfolding of what had always been arriving. The settlement of the territory deepened, the railroad extended, Caldwell itself became more permanently itself, with a proper school and a doctor's office that was more than occasional, and a community of people who had decided collectively that this was where they were going to stay. Thomas grew into a serious and capable young man who was going to be a rancher in the same way that some people are going to be something, because everything about them is organized around it. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's precise attention, and when Perry began teaching him the business side of the operation in earnest, he learned it with an appetite that was a father's deep satisfaction to watch. Eleanor was, by any measure, remarkable. She finished the local schooling available in Caldwell, with a facility that made the schoolmaster write Dorothy a letter saying, with the careful professional language of a man who does not want to overstate, that her daughter had capacities that exceeded what was available in the area. Dorothy read this letter and showed it to Perry, and they sat with it seriously, because what it implied was a question about Eleanor's future that would require real decisions. They talked to Eleanor. She was 13 by this time, and she said with the composed directness that had been characteristic of her from her earliest days that she would like to study medicine. Perry and Dorothy looked at each other over the dinner table. "That is a considerable path," Dorothy said. "I know," Eleanor said. "But it's the right one." Dorothy thought about a woman in 1879 arriving at the edge of a strange town with everything she owned in one bag, because the path that was right had led her there regardless of how difficult it was. She thought about the rose cutting. She thought about the letter she had written about surviving the uprooting. "We'll find out what it takes," she said. "We will," Perry said, which meant they would. It took considerable research and considerable arrangement, and ultimately it resulted in Alina, at 16, going to live with Perry's sister in Wichita, where there was a better school and, eventually, preparation for further study. It was the hardest thing Dorothy had done in years, putting her daughter on the train to Wichita. But Alina stood straight on the platform and kissed her mother and her father and told them she would write every week, and she kept her word. James grew up somewhere between his siblings, not Thomas's outdoor intensity nor Alina's scholarly fire, but a boy with a wonderful easy warmth, the kind of person who makes every room more comfortable simply by being in it, who could talk to anyone and find something genuine in the conversation. Perry said once, watching James at 14 talking easily with the new hand who was too shy to manage more than monosyllables with anyone else, that James had gotten the best of both of them and arranged it in an entirely original way. Dorothy thought this was the most beautiful thing her husband had ever said, which was extraordinary given the competition. Mrs. Helen Greer died in the winter of 1896 at the age of 67, peacefully, and in her own bed in the house behind the shop that she had inhabited for 25 years. Dorothy sat with her in the last days, and they talked about the shop and the town and the years of it, and Mrs. Greer said, near the end, that her life had been a good one, and that she was grateful for it in full measure, and Dorothy believed her completely. She was buried in the Caldwell cemetery on a cold, clear February day, and Dorothy and Perry stood at the grave with Thomas, who was 15, and James, who was 6, and there were many people there because Mrs. Greer had been Caldwell for 25 years in a way that few individuals are any place, and her absence was a real and felt thing. Dorothy kept the shop named Barrett and Greer. She kept it that way until the shop closed 20 years later, when she was past working age and Alice Pratt's daughter had a millinery shop next door, and there was less call for a dedicated dressmaker in a time when goods could be ordered from catalogs. But that was far in the future, and for now the sign over the door with both names on it was exactly what it had always been, a small and proper honoring. The years moved in the way that years move when life is full and good, not slowly or quickly, but steadily. The way the rose climbed the south wall of the house, putting out growth each season that in retrospect seemed inevitable, but in the moment was always a small surprise. Perry turned 50 in 1900, and they marked it with a gathering at the ranch that Thomas, now 21 and increasingly the one managing the daily operations, organized with a thoroughness that made both his parents laugh and feel old in the best possible way. Alina came from Wichita, where she was in the final stage of her medical training, and she and Dorothy sat on the south porch together in the June evening and watched Perry and Thomas working with a new horse in the near pasture, the father still moving with the easy authority of a man who knows cattle and land entirely, the son beside him already with the same quality in his own original version. "He looks well," Alina said. "He is well," Dorothy said. "He says 50 is the same as 49 with a better view." Alina laughed. She had her mother's laugh, which Dorothy had not known until she heard it in her grown daughter. "What does that mean?" "I think it means he is content," Dorothy said. Alina looked at her mother for a moment in the particular evaluating way she had developed further since her medical training. "You both are," she said. "It's remarkable, actually. You're both genuinely content." "Is that remarkable?" As a general rule of human experience, Alina said, "Yes, fairly." Dorothy looked out at the pasture where Perry was walking the new horse through its paces with Thomas at his shoulder, the two of them talking in the low way they had when they were working something through together. The rose was full behind them, perfuming the warm evening air, and the Kansas sky was doing those things it did in June with the light that she had loved for 20 years and had not yet run out of words to think about. "I arrived here with everything I owned in one bag," she said. "And your father was the first person to say anything kind to me." "I know the story," Eleanor said. "You know the outline," Dorothy said. "You don't know what it felt like to stand at the edge of that town and not know what was coming, and then to have it all come so well." Eleanor put her arm around her mother's shoulders, the competent, careful arm of a person who is going to be a doctor and has already learned to inhabit her own strength, and they sat together on the porch, while Perry and Thomas worked the horse in the golden evening, and James, 20 years old and visiting from the farm operation he was establishing in the next county, came around the corner of the house with a bucket of water for the kitchen garden and waved at them. And the rows stood tall and full and rooted deep in the Kansas ground. In 1905, Eleanor completed her medical training and returned to Caldwell to practice, setting up a small but serious operation in the rooms above what had been Harrison Dowd's bank and was now operated by his son. She was one of the few female physicians in the region, a fact that created initial resistance from some quarters and complete indifference from others, and she managed both with the composed directness she had always had. Within 2 years she was trusted and in demand because competence, even in 1905 Kansas, eventually overcomes most resistance when it is consistent and genuine. She did not, as Dorothy had privately expected, remain unmarried. She met a man named Clifford Reyes in 1906, a Mexican-American doctor who had been practicing medicine in the region since 1901, and who was, in Eleanor's assessment, the most intelligent and morally consistent person she had encountered in professional life, which was, as she explained to her parents, the correct way to evaluate a potential life partner. Perry met Clifford on a Sunday when Eleanor brought him to the ranch for dinner, and afterward Perry said to Dorothy, in the kitchen while Eleanor showed Clifford the rose, that he liked the man very well and could see immediately why Eleanor did. Dorothy looked through the window at her daughter and the man her daughter had chosen, standing in the June evening by the rose bush that had begun life as a cutting carried in a leather bag to a town at the edge of the known world. "Good," she said. Thomas married a woman named Sarah Connolly in 1903, a rancher's daughter from north of Caldwell who had grown up with cattle and had opinions about land management that she was not shy about expressing. And Perry thought this was excellent, and Dorothy thought she was exactly right for Thomas, which she was. They had a son in 1904, a red-haired boy named William Perry Talbot, and Dorothy and Perry became grandparents on a morning in October with a straightforward completeness that filled both of them with a happiness that required very little language. James, settled on his own farming operation with the warmth and competence that characterized everything he did, married a woman named Ruth McKinley in 1907, and they were happy in the same open, easy way that James was happy in most things, and they had a daughter in 1908 and a son in 1910, and another son in 1912, and the family of Dorothy and Perry Talbot spread itself across South Kansas in the way of a rose planted in good ground. Perry turned 60 in 1910, and Dorothy turned 56, and they were people who had earned their faces, the lines and weathering of a life lived mostly outdoors and always fully engaged with what was in front of them. They were still, observably and without pretense, in love, in the practical and daily and particular way of two people who have chosen each other every day for 31 years. They still walked in the evenings when the season allowed it, out across the land they owned, past the cattle in the near pasture, and the garden Dorothy kept with the same steady attention she had always kept things, and over the low hill to the place where you could see in every direction without obstruction, the whole flat, gorgeous immensity of the Kansas prairie, and they walked with their hands occasionally finding each other in the way of long habit, and they talked or did not talk with equal comfort. And the walk home in the evening light was always the same, the house coming into view on its slight rise with the lamplight warm in the window, and the south wall rose catching the last of the sun. Dorothy had kept the leather bag. It was in the bottom of the wardrobe in their bedroom, worn smooth from years and considerably more battered than it had been in 1878, and she did not use it, but she kept it because it was the thing she had arrived with, the container of everything she was when her life in Caldwell began, and it deserved to be kept. Perry knew it was there. He had known for years. He had never said anything about it except once, when they were moving things around in the wardrobe and he took it out and held it for a moment. "This is the one," he said. "That's the one," she said. He held it with a care that was out of proportion to its current monetary value, which was approximately nothing, and exactly proportional to what it actually was, which was the thing he had carried for her on the morning everything started. He put it back in the wardrobe with both hands. In the spring of 1915, Perry and Dorothy celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. They celebrated it on the south porch with a dinner Dorothy made, the particular meal she had made for every anniversary since the first, roasted chicken and a dried apple cake, because it was the dinner of the first year and had become simply the anniversary dinner. And they sat in the warm May evening with the rose blooming around them and listened to the Kansas wind in the prairie grass. "I have been thinking," Perry said, "about something you said once. About how the bag was heavy with everything you had lost, and then with the rose, which was everything you were trying to keep." Dorothy looked at him. "I don't remember saying exactly that." "You said something like it," he said. "In a letter early on." She thought about the letter. She had written it in winter by lamplight with the rose cutting on the windowsill. "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I have been trying for 36 years to deserve having been the person you let carry it." She put down her fork and looked at him fully. "Perry," she said. "I mean it seriously," he said. "It's not a small thing to have someone trust you with everything they are." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and held it, and the rose bloomed in the May evening, and the prairie went in every direction. And Thomas was in the east pasture with his son, who was 11 years old and already devoted to the cattle. And Alina was in Caldwell healing people with the steady, competent hands she had inherited. And James was on his farm 20 miles west with Ruth and their children. And the leather bag was in the wardrobe in the bedroom. And the tin box with her father's photograph was on the mantel in the sitting room, and the life was full and rooted and real. "You have," she said. "You have every single day." He turned his hand under hers and held it, and they sat there as the evening came down, and the first stars appeared above the Kansas plain, and it was 36 years from the morning she had stood at the edge of a cattle town with a heavy bag, and heard a voice she had not known would change everything. And it had not changed everything in the dramatic sudden way of stories that resolve in an instant, but in the patient, growing way of a rose cutting that is carried carefully and planted in good ground and tended and given light and allowed to put its roots down deep. That was how it had happened. That was how it was. The lamplight came on in the house behind them, automatic now after years. Perry had wired a simple lamp to a long cord so that it could be lit from the porch in the evenings without going inside. A small domestic ingenuity that Dorothy had told him was the most thoughtful thing he had ever built. The lamp came on and spilled its warm yellow light through the south window, and the rose cast its shadow on the wall, the same shadow it had always cast, larger now and more branched, the shadow of something that had grown for 36 years in exactly the right place. Dorothy looked at that shadow and then at her husband in the lamplight, this man who had been everything she had needed before she knew she needed anything, and she felt the fullness of it all the way through, the way you feel something that is both an ending and a continuation, the closing of a long story that is also simply the current page of a life that goes on. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cool." He stood and took her hand, and they went inside together into the warm lamplight, and the door closed behind them, and the rose stood in its place against the wall, and the Kansas night came down full and quiet and full of stars over the Barrett Talbot place, over the house and the garden and the cattle and the pasture, over the wide flat miracle of the prairie, and everything was where it was supposed to be, and everything was well.